Eu tenho a honra, estou muito grata de estar aqui para convidá-lo ao palco, porque ele foi um dos primeiros autores que eu comecei a ler quando me interessei pelo tema sustentabilidade, né, pelo Triple Bottom Line. Então, vê-lo aqui, fazer uma foto com ele, abraçá-lo, para mim é uma grande honra. Realmente estou muito honrada de participar desse momento, Cazé.
Eu também estou muito feliz de estarmos aqui em meio às árvores do Parque do Ibirapuera, esse coração verde de São Paulo, para receber o visionário que veio até aqui para compartilhar o seu conhecimento sobre esse assunto. Vamos chamar ao palco uma salva de palmas, por favor, John Elkington.
Mr. Elkington, such a great pleasure having you here.
Everyone else got a kiss, so Rosanna, thank you, and thank you very much for the introduction. And now for the Rolling Stones, only for one reason. At least the Rolling Stones had 5 people when they started, so they could have had one person on each of the edges of the stage and one to spare. Paolo, Cristiano, Francisco, thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks for the welcome. I'm going to talk you through some of the work that we've been doing, some of the thinking that we've been involved in recently. But firstly, it's an immense privilege to be here with Klabin, and it's wonderful to see so many of the company's people here today. It was also a great privilege earlier on today to talk to Edson Pavoni, the artist who has done these extraordinary paper sculptures at the other end of the space, and I hope you will see more of that later on today. So let me just start by saying my title is Riding Green Swans. I'll explain that in just a moment. And the subtitle, which you'll see is the subtitle of the new book, is The Coming Boom in Regenerative Capitalism. So if this will work, and it will, that is the book. And I'm just going to give you a few initial comments to explain where we fit into the broader sustainability landscape. And then I'm going to talk about this moment in history where we find ourselves, the Anthropocene, a moment where one species, our own, Homo sapiens, influences the planet in a way that has never happened before. And that era is now 72 years old. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. I'll also talk about different horizons that business in particular, and now also financial markets, are starting to focus on. I'm going to talk about the third horizon there. Let me just go back. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to talk about a moment, too, where suddenly an old order, an old world order that we've all grown up in, is starting to come apart, is starting to weaken and be disrupted. And I think that is not going to end. It's not going to turn around and become suddenly wonderful. It's going to accelerate over time. Impact is a word that you hear much more these days in this space. It used to be negative impact, as with environmental impact studies. Now it's positive impact and net impact as well. I'm going to talk about swans relatively briefly, but black swans, you will know some of the story there, and then green swans as well. And I will also conclude by saying increasingly, I know that there is an election coming up. I will be very careful not to talk about that election, but increasingly, these issues are becoming political, whether we like that or not, and business increasingly and business leaders have to acknowledge that business leadership role. This morning, I saw that Generation Investment Management, Al Gore and David Blood's firm, which I have huge respect for, and they've helped fund some of our work, published their 6th Sustainability Trends report. I'm just going to show you 2 diagrams from that report. This is the first one, and it shows population, which is the pale blue line at the bottom, and then a range of other materials, not paper, not cardboard, and so on. I'll come into that in a moment. But extraordinary growth in all of these materials, and at the same time, if you look at nature, if you look at the wild world, the trends are all going very much in the same direction. I'm digging, or at least my daughter is digging with a friend, a wildlife pond in our garden in London. And to do that, we've had to get plants, we've had to get an electric pump, we've had to get all sorts of materials in. The amount of cardboard that has come in to our home in the last sort of month or so has been absolutely extraordinary. And it just made me think, this is wonderful material that you're sitting on, but increasingly there is this question of how do you bring this into a circular economy? And we'll probably touch on that a little later on. So very quickly, where we fit into the landscape. When I first came into this space 50 years ago, that cartoon, which I found more or less at that time, summarized the problem that we had. We had a central challenge, but people saw that challenge in very, very different ways. Now, the first number in between there is 50. So this year, I mark 50 years professionally in this space. Over that time, I've set up 4 what we would now call social businesses since 1978. They all still exist. I've got 3 professorships. I've sat on over 80 boards and advisory boards, and I'm a paper person. I write books. I've written now 21 books, but I think we're only just getting started. And I think the next 10 to 15 years of my working life, if I'm given them, will be the most exciting, the most challenging, and the most politically dangerous of my entire working career. So in the front row here, we have Louise Kjellerup-Roper, who is our CEO at Volans. When we set up Volans back in 2008, the organizations that the team came from were Sustainability, which I co-founded in 1987, and the World Economic Forum. And when we set up in 2008, right in the middle of the financial crisis, not a rather stupid time, you might think, to set up a new business, but actually quite a good time, our focus was on system change. And we might have assumed, after the financial crisis, that governments around the world would think about how do you transform capitalism so these things do not happen so often, and when they do, they're not so damaging. That didn't happen, we all know. We all tried very hard to put capitalism back together again. One of the things we launched about 5 or 6 years ago was an inquiry with help from businesses, with help from foundations, to look at the future of capitalism over time. And one of the things that we increasingly feel is that the responsibility era in this capitalism world of ours, capitalism-directed world of ours, is ending. Doesn't mean that we do not have to be responsible. In fact, we're being asked to be responsible on more and more fronts as business leaders. But at the same time, it's not working. We start to have all sorts of resilience challenges where they're economic, they're social, critically they're political, and increasingly they're environmental as well. So one of the things that we're beginning to look at is what is the role of business leaders and their companies in playing the political game. And I know there are industry federations in the room, so not simply asking their industry federations to do this for them, but what is their role directly in dealing with politicians, with policymakers, with regulators, and so on. These are some of the people we work with. We're a B Corporation. I hope, how many people in the room are B Corporations? A few. Hopefully next time I'm in São Paulo, there will be a lot more. It's a wonderful movement, Sistema B in Brazil. And we also, just finally, work for a number of organizations like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, looking at questions like, what are the long-term implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly on markets, particularly on business? So, one of the things that we started to talk about 10 years ago was zero, how increasingly business would need to, as it had done in quality, as it had done in safety, and to some degree in health, start to use zero-based targets in relation, for example, to greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide. And one of the things that my colleague Louise did a few years ago was, with the Houses of Parliament in the United Kingdom, set up a platform called Bankers for Net Zero, bringing the UK banks together to work on the question of how do they best support small and medium-sized enterprises in starting to go after that net zero transition. A series of reports published there. Let me just say a few quick words about the Anthropocene. There are many different views as to when the Anthropocene started. One idea is that it happened with this atomic explosion in the southwest of the United States in 1945. There are also people who argue that it started when Europeans moved to the Americas. And in the space of 100 years, 56 million people died in the Americas. And as some of you will know, what happened then, as they stopped farming, trees came back, carbon was pulled out of the atmosphere, and suddenly Europe, for example, was plunged into a cool period because of that extraordinary dying of people. But whenever it started, and increasingly the consensus is that it started in 1950, just to be tidy, we are living in a very different era. This is an American futurist, Alex Stefan. I like him very much. I will not read the quotation out, but I think he's right. This is not simply a moment where we reshuffle the pack. This is a moment where we have to think very, very differently indeed. And in 2011, so almost, just over a decade ago, The Economist published this survey of the Anthropocene. If you haven't read it, even now, all of that time later, it was an extremely long survey. I recommend it really, really highly. It just explains why this is so different, this period of our history. Wherever we look in the world now, whether we look in Asia, whether we look in the Americas, whether we look in Europe, if we look in Africa, we're seeing these sorts of images. This is the Bobcat fire in 2020, but this year we've seen them everywhere. We've seen droughts, we've seen floods, we've seen rivers that have not run dry in thousands of years, increasingly running dry. And this isn't just one country, it's not just one region. Increasingly, this is worldwide. So this globe just shows the pattern of some of the superheating, super warming events that have been happening this year. Louise happens to be Danish. I quite like Danish people. And this sculpture is one of a number in Copenhagen where they've raised the height of the benches to show where the sea level rises will be by about 2100. And Louise just went to Greenland about 3 weeks ago and saw the glaciers melting. Most of us talk about this, but do not yet properly understand what the implications for our world is going to be. Let me just quickly talk about this U-bend. So I don't know whether you are optimist or pessimist. I suspect most of you, most of the time, are optimists. I was born an optimist. You have to be to work in this space in many ways. But I do not believe that technology on its own will save us. I think we need a very profound values-based cultural shift at the same time. And this is the U-bend. So I started to talk about this about 5 or 6 years ago. It's the first diagram in the Green Swans book. And it's making a very simple point. We have grown up in a macroeconomic and geopolitical order since the Second World War, which we more or less take for granted. Global governance institutions like the United Nations, a range of other standards and rules and so on, they're coming apart. I don't say that lightly, and I don't say that with any great positivity, but in history, when these moments have happened and an old order does come apart, new ones start to emerge. And actually, I think it's going to be much easier at times to drive sustainability-based initiatives in this new order than it was before. Over time, a range of shocks will continue to drive us in this direction. So we've all been in lockdown around the world. Some of us have learned lessons from that, some of us haven't. But one of the lessons I think we should have learned is that there are systemic dysfunctions in the system that we've built since the Second World War. And in some ways, the Ukrainian conflict is another example of that. We have assumed that peace will be always there, and peace will not always be there, and we need institutions that can help us cope with all of that. I was in Costa Rica when Putin invaded Ukraine. And you're suddenly having to look at these two separate realities of devastation and degeneration driven by Russia, or at least the Russian government. And at the same time, some countries trying to reweight the balance, and in the case of Costa Rica, starting to focus on regeneration. And this war is not simply a war in a distant place. It is already, we're seeing it having implications on markets. We're talking about energy security. We're talking about food security. We're talking, of course, about climate security and water security. It's interesting that that security word is coming through now so often. And this, again, front cover of the Economist, I think, neatly captures some of that. This was a study done by Globescan. They're a Canadian organization based in Toronto. They survey experts in the sustainability space around the world. And the question here was, what is the impact of the conflict in Ukraine going to be over time? It's quite interesting. And the Generation Investment Management Report this morning makes the same point, that renewable energy is about to get a huge boost because of the dangers of relying on, in this case, Russian oil. There are many other points. I won't go into them at the moment. I mentioned all of these pictures that are coming up around the world. This is from China, and some of you will have seen earlier this year an HSBC analyst, Stuart Kirk, saying in public, which wasn't very clever, but I think it was very accurate, who cares if Florida, or in this case Miami, goes underwater by 2100? That's not our business. That's not what we're in business to think about. We think 5, 6 years into the future. Well, as it happens, he lost his job, but actually I think it was a good and helpful warning from Stuart Kirk, because financial markets as yet do not properly address these sorts of issues. And in recent years, we've seen younger people waking up. I don't know how many of you have children. One of the things I've heard from directors of major companies around the world is they're being beaten up at the breakfast table by their teenage children, basically challenged. Are you an eco-criminal? And this isn't just one, it isn't just 3, it isn't just 5. It's people routinely starting to say this to me. And I think that's unhealthy, because young people are increasingly getting deeply nervous about, particularly in this case, climate change. This study, reported in Nature magazine, Science Journal, 10,000 young people around the world, questions around how worried are you, how anxious are you about climate change? Really quite interesting to see that the top 3 countries, I didn't expect it, were the Philippines, India, and Brazil. And among the developed countries, the country which reported the highest levels of concern was Portugal, because of the fires probably there. So I'm just going to quickly pop up some questions that I ask myself routinely. The first one is, if you could bring future generations back into today's world, what would they vote for? What would they vote against? What would they invest in? What stocks and shares, if they held them, would they want to sell? Who would they want to work with? Who would they not want to work with? And critically, what would they want us to know now that we should know sooner rather than later? I was in Barcelona last week, and one of the other speakers was Bella Lack, who is 19. And she just traveled right around the world talking to young climate activists and has written a book about that. I really do recommend what some of these younger people are starting to try and tell us. I'm finding it immensely helpful. The third horizon. Let me just quickly run through that. Some of you may have seen me talk about this cartoon. I had it done by a Financial Times cartoonist, Ingram Pin, in 1991, a long time ago. And the idea is that around the boardroom table, we would need, over time, a voice for nature, a voice for the social agenda, and at that time, a voice for the long-term future. And the robot was a bit of a joke. That was sort of trying to say long-term future. It's no longer a joke. Some of you will know that in 2014, in Hong Kong, the first expert system was appointed to a board. Why? Because these issues are becoming so complex that boards are going to need very sophisticated IT support over time. I recalled that idea, which had evolved into the triple bottom line, in 2018 through the Harvard Business Review. The HBR editors told me it was the first time in their history where a management concept had been recalled by its author. I didn't do it lightly, and I didn't do it because I thought it was a stupid idea. I did it because I felt that many people were misinterpreting the triple bottom line. They thought it was about trade-offs. You know, we do the financial bit, not the full economic bit. We do the social bit. We provide jobs. We provide people with what they need. Shame about the environment would be one form of the calculation. But it's very clear that a whole range of different issues are now coming up around the world. This was in 2020. It was in the New York Times. 50 years previously, the New York Times had published Milton Friedman's column in which he had launched, in effect, neo-capitalism by saying the only business of business is to make a profit, is business in a way. And this was a group of 300 NGOs, ONGs, coming together and saying, what are the agenda items, the priorities that we increasingly want governments, financial markets, business to address? And very interesting to see among them the regeneration word, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. Sustainable Development Goals, incredibly important push to this agenda, but still very complicated for most people. Most people are still struggling. How do I do 17 things at the same time? I'll come back to the UN in just a second. Don't read the small print on this chart, not least because it's in English. But what this is meant to show is that same shift where an old order comes apart. We then have a period of very, very complex, challenging resilience issues where our systems are challenged. And the only way I know longer term to ensure the resilience of systems, economic, social again, political, the biosphere, is to regenerate them. And that's why I think Sustainability will remain a key term, but underneath it, that regenerative economy language is going to come through very, very powerfully. And if you ask me where even the best companies are now, they're somewhere in that middle ground, struggling, coping with resilience issues. I think regeneration is going to come up the curve too, because it's optimistic. Sustainability, in a sense, we all want it, but still, what is it? What does it look like when we get there? Regeneration is, I think, perhaps more actionable. And for those who don't know Paul Hawken and don't know regeneration.org, I recommend very highly his new book, relatively new book, Regeneration, and the platform or the database that they've put together of regenerative activities by sector, by geography, by size of organization around the world. Acciona is not a Brazilian or even a Portuguese company, it's a Spanish company. You will probably all know that. They are in infrastructure and they are in renewable energy. The CEO, José Manuel Entrecanales, came to us a few years back and said, would we take 27 of his young people and put them through a process where they would be asked to draft the master plan, sustainability master plan for Acciona. We did that. At the end of the process, the young people, there were 27, I think, in the core, the young people said, no, we're not going to do a 5-year master plan and strategy. We're going to do a 10-year master plan and strategy. And no, it's not going to be just sustainability. It's going to be for the business as a whole. That's quite interesting when younger people say that. And what happened was Acciona said, fine. And they've now got a new strapline called Regenerative by Design. But what's been quite interesting, and yesterday Louise and I went to the Linea 6, the Line 6 subway construction project, and we walked through some of these huge tunnels and talked to the team behind it about what they're doing on social and environmental and governance issues. And in the front row here, we have EcoVadis. I should declare an interest. I've been on EcoVadis advisory panel since they started. But what they do is they work with supply chains around the world. And it started very small. It's now over 100,000 businesses that they engage with around the world. But anyone who gets the chance to go through those tunnels, I really do recommend that very highly. So, impact. I very briefly discussed the impact agenda a moment ago. But we all hear this new language of environment, social, governance, linked investment. It's fantastic. It's exciting. Everyone's talking about it. And it's a feeding frenzy. It's like when you throw meat into a crocodile pond, and it's not going to last. And the pushback has started quite violently in some ways in Texas and Florida. You've got some people like Elon Musk saying, why is Tesla, which has done more to disrupt the automotive industry and push us towards electric vehicles, being excluded from this ranking when ExxonMobil, God help us, the oil company that's lobbied so hard against effective action on climate change, is being brought in. Now, there are perhaps reasons for that. But then I was just talking earlier on, well, I think it's Rosanna, about the Economist survey recently about ESG. And what the economists concluded was, again, that this is a bit of a feeding frenzy. It's not going to last in quite the way that it's going. And they suggested some ways to deal with that. I have a slightly different view. I stole this image, but to me, this is where we are in all of this. We're evolving our thinking, we're evolving our practices, We're evolving the agenda, the change agenda, over time. And I think ESG is a stepping stone in the right direction. But we have to be very careful how we do it. In Switzerland, we're working with Novartis, the global healthcare company. And about 3 years ago, for the first time ever, don't try and read the small numbers. I'll try and, I see people squinting through their glasses. My apologies. What they're doing is trying to put a financial valuation on social and environmental performance and outcomes. I have to say, I personally am slightly nervous about that approach, but I have now for 4 years have chaired the Novartis Impact Valuation Advisory Council. And I think more and more companies over time will go this route. Another organization we're involved in is the Smart Surfaces Coalition in the United States. Many of you who live in cities may have found the city that you live in warming up. If you live in a city like Baltimore, for example, the black populations live in very crowded areas, which on balance are 10 degrees warmer than where the wealthier parts of the population live. You can say put in air conditioning. Lovely idea, but all air conditioning does is pump heat out into the streets. An example of what's happening around the world, India this year, the year without a spring, as they call it. And again, what Smart Services Coalition are trying to do, I'm not going to go through these numbers, but they're starting to look at the cost-benefit equations for different ways of controlling urban heating. So tree planting, most obviously, painting roofs white or having green roofs, also taking pavement and parking lots and turning those into, putting those new materials that bounce solar energy back into the atmosphere. And I think these two examples, Novartis and the Smart Surfaces Coalition, are examples, illustrations of what's going to happen. Economics is currently dysfunctional and will need to change quite profoundly over time. And that's what those people, 300 groups in the New York Times, were saying. A couple of final sections. I mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm sure you're all fluent, and if I ask you to name what SDG 11 is or SDG 16, you'll all be able to tell me. I can't remember them to save my life. But one thing that was very quickly obvious from the SDGs is they're exponential goals. These are not goals that will be met incrementally. If you look at the no poverty, zero hunger by 2030, those are super exponential goals. We're not going to get there. We'll try, hopefully. But again, I think we've got to recognize the nature of what we're facing here. Nassim Nicholas Taleb wrote his extraordinary book, The Black Swan, just before the 2007 financial crisis. Many of you will have read it, I hope. And one of the things he said was, there are these black swans that come along and they're unexpected. They come out of the blue. They have a huge impact, much bigger than we might have expected. But unfortunately, afterwards, we sit down, we try and work out what's just happened to us, and we very often get it wrong. We learn the wrong lessons, and I think we may be doing that again with COVID-19. He was asked, as some of you will know, whether COVID-19 was a black swan. And his answer was absolutely not. We saw it coming. We saw coronaviruses coming. We saw pandemics coming. We had government units set up. We had reports published. And then we ignored much of that stuff. So a green swan, by contrast, at least in my mind, are market shifts, political shifts, cultural shifts, which take us in profoundly different and very often exponential directions. The most obvious example these days is renewable energy. This is for solar, but it could be done for wind, it could be done for battery energy storage, And what you see is this extraordinary decline in the price point of solar energy. There should be, but that's not showing here, there's a band towards the bottom of this, which shows where the price point of existing coal-fired power stations currently sits. And these trends are coming underneath that zone very, very rapidly indeed. And this is our problem. This is the problem that we all face. Our brains are not configured to deal with exponentials. We're very, very poor at understanding these sorts of trends that start very slowly and seem to underperform the normal line and then suddenly go berserk. And that's one of the reasons why I put the robot there, that in a way we will need artificial intelligence expert systems to help us with all of this. Again, I'm not going to read out the language on this slide. One of the companies that we work with in Finland is Neste. What they're doing is they're coming out of oil. They were the state-owned oil company, and they're increasingly going into renewable energy, into sustainable aviation fuels, and also into circular materials. But just look at some of the words used there, like transformation. I think increasingly we're going to see companies using that sort of language. Not easy. I mentioned sustainable aviation fuels. They're doing a good job on those, I think. But they had a contract. I see one or two nodding heads in the audience. They had a contract with Coldplay. And Coldplay, the band, were using sustainable aviation fuels from Neste to fly around the world. And a small NGO went for Neste and said, but you've also got problems in Malaysia and Indonesia and so on. And so Coldplay dropped the contract, but they continue to use the fuel. And I think what this shows that, even when we start to work with NGOs, with activists, with campaigners, we're still going to have these disagreements. Let me just come towards a conclusion and give you a few examples of where I think this agenda is starting to go. And it's very different from anything that we've seen to date. Right at the beginning of this century, for about 5 years, I worked with Bill Ford at the Ford Motor Company. If you had told him then that the Ford Motor Company that invented the internal combustion engine, or at least invented the Model T, would eventually split itself in two, he would have said, absolute madness, nonsense, it's not true. Elon Musk again. That's just exactly what Ford have done. They've now got a business looking at the internal combustion engine, and they've got a business looking at the electric future. Let me take one more example. Solvay, a chemical company, splitting itself in two. One part is a legacy chemicals business that is a sort of cash cow, as people would once have put it. And then there's this new business. And interestingly, the new business is already bigger than the legacy business. And the new business is looking, for example, at lightweighting, at circular economy solutions, sustainable mobility, and so on. I think what we're going to see is an increasingly structural set of solutions to sustainability. So finally, a few points about the political aspects of all of these. Who would have thought that the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, would be saying this sort of thing now? And today, he was in the media saying the public relations industry is virtually criminal in the way that it's been helping the oil industry, fossil fuels industry, do what it's done over time. What leadership, what astonishing leadership from the UN. And you're starting to see the political pushback. So, for example, Scott Morrison, not my favorite political leader, Prime Minister in Australia for a while, holding up a lump of coal in the Australian Parliament and saying, this is the future. Well, truly, no, it's not the future. And what then happened was he was swept out of office by Tony Albanese, and the social and environmental agenda is actually what drove him out of office. I find that quite encouraging. I also find what the Biden administration is now doing in the United States very encouraging too. It's less than we had hoped, but it's still the biggest ever push in the direction of the clean circular economy. And a final example would be this one. About 18 months ago, we started to work in the United Arab Emirates, working for the first Abu Dhabi bank. One of the reasons we decided we would work with them is that they're the only bank in the Gulf region that has a woman, a female CEO. And she, Hannah, has been recently invited by the UAE government to chair a government global council. So this is Sustainable Development Goal 7 around future fuels, looking at what the UAE can do over time to embrace non-fossil fuels, which is extraordinary because they're a fossil fuel-based organism or society or economy. And what they're looking at is the question is, what can we do to repurpose the infrastructure that we already have for oil and gas for things like hydrogen? Really, really exciting work. Final slide, second final slide. I was here about 3-4 weeks ago in Sao Paulo working with Sebrae, who deal, as you know, with small and medium-sized enterprises. And one of the groups that I talked to there was from the International Chamber of Commerce in Brazil. Who would have thought that the International Chamber of Commerce would be calling for Brazil to become a carbon credit superpower? It happened a little while ago. You will all know about it. But when I think about your country, that's one of those moments where I think, whoa, there is something here that is immensely exciting, that if Brazil got behind it properly, and not just business. Business cannot do this on its own. It absolutely needs government to come in behind. So we'll be watching you with great interest over time, and if this will work, just a quick summary. U-bend, take about 12 to 15 years minimum to clear. If I can get this working. Probably pointing in the wrong direction. Change is, whether we like it or not, going exponential. The challenges are going exponential, but the opportunities, market opportunities, are doing the same. Business is absolutely central, which is why what Klabin has been doing in, throughout its history, but particularly in recent years, is so exciting. But there is this political element. Intergenerational politics are going to be profoundly important in all of this. And it was interesting, the Shell CEO just recently asked his senior colleagues, is Shell on the right side of history or not? And I think the evidence at the moment suggests probably not. And then this thing about waves. There are these wave structures that come through our societies, and successful business leaders have always ridden those waves. The question now is, can they also shape them? So let me, again, if I can make this work. Wonderful, thank you. So this is my last slide. I'm just saying thank you to you as an audience for paying attention, particularly when I'm speaking in English. I apologize for that. There is my email address. I answer every email I'm sent. And Volan's website there as well. But again, immense thanks for this invitation and for your attention. And Rosanna, if I may, I'll hand back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. John Elkington. Thank you very much. Uma salva de palmas, por favor.
Thank you very much, John Elkington. Thank you.